In the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel, we find one of the most mysterious visions in all of Tanakh. And it begins like this. This is the third pasuk of the 8th chapter. He says, Ve'esaenai ve'er'e ve'hine ayil echad omed lifnei ha'uval ve'lo karnaim. So as I looked and saw a ram standing between me and the river, and he had two horns. Ve'karnaim gvohot ve'achat gavoa min hashenit ve'hagavoa ola ba'achrona. Says, and the horns were high, one higher than the other, and the higher one sprouted last. Okay, that's the beginning of this very mysterious vision. Daniel sees a mighty ram with two horns, and at first Daniel doesn't understand what this represents. But the angel Gabriel explains to him that this great animal represents the kingdom of Persia, which is made up of two parts, Paras Umadai, the two horns in the vision. And then out of nowhere, a great male goat appears, and it has one single horn. And this beast emerges from the west and gores the mighty ram. And the angel, Gabriel, explains that this represents Alexander the Great, who came from the west and conquered the Persian Empire. And then the goat's single horn shatters into four parts, just as Alexander the Great's kingdom splintered into multiple Hellenistic kingdoms after his death. And the vision goes on. One of the segments of the goat's shattered horn grows and grows, quote, toward the beautiful land. And when it gets there, it attacks the heavens and attacks God himself. And it, quote, puts an end to the tamid, basically the daily offering, okay? And, quote, throws truth to the ground. So what does all that represent? That's a not so subtle reference to Antiochus, the king of the Seleucid Greeks that we know from the Hanukkah story, who defiled the temple and ends the sacrifice. So far, the meaning of the vision, kind of follows. Where we basically get a pretty good explanation, or it's pretty clear what's going on. Then a heavenly voice rings out and asks, Ad matai hachazon? How long will this vision last? Meaning, how long will this awful vision of destruction and defilement of the temple go on? And the voice then turns to Daniel and says, or it says, Vayomer Elai, and the voice said to me, this is Daniel speaking in the first person, Ad Erev Boker Alpaim Veshlosh Meot. For 2,300 evenings and mornings. What exactly does that mean? 23 evenings and mornings. Until what exactly? And then the voice calls out and says, Gabriel, explain to the man this vision. It says, Vayomer Elai, Haven ben Adam, ki la'et ketz hachazon. He says this is Daniel says, that Gabriel said to me, understand, Ben Adam, understand, O man, that the vision refers to the Ketz, to the end of days. And here's how that chapter ends. The angel Gabriel says, he says, what was said in the vision about evenings and mornings was true. Umar'eh ha'erev ve'haboker asher ne'emar emetu. Ve'ata stom hechazon ki leyamim rabim. Now you keep the vision a secret. You be quiet about this vision because it relates to far off days. And Daniel says that he is stricken ill by all that he's seen, and he's dismayed by the vision, and he could not explain it. Wow, this is a very deep chapter. What happened? What happened there? Daniel has this kind of trippy dream with all these animals showing up and defeating each other. And all that imagery is explained to us so that it's kind of clear about the various empires, etc. But then we have this mysterious line that all this will end after 300 evenings and mornings. And we're told that this has to do with the timing of the end of days. And Daniel is told that he should be quiet about it all because while it's true, it's a secret. Okay, so this is deep stuff. That's going to be our topic for tonight, the Ketz, the concept of a cutoff point, you could say it's a predestined outside date for the coming of the end of days. So that's our game plan for tonight. First, we're going to look at the history of this topic of calculating the Ketz in our Jewish sources, and that has actually an interesting history. And then all that will kind of be a background for a certain speech that I think is a very interesting speech that was given by Rav Yehuda Amital, who is the former Rosh Yeshiva of Gush, of Yeshivat Har Etzion. It's a speech from about 20 years ago, but we'll see that the speech strangely connects a lot with some things that are going on today. So, okay, that's the game plan. We'll start with the background, with the history, and then that will kind of set the stage for a more modern piece, which we'll learn together in the second half of this year. So let's start with the history and the background. As we saw, this idea of estimating the Ketz, the end of days, the date of end times, in some sense goes back to Tanakh itself. The book of Daniel had those visions that we talked about, this mysterious reference to 2300 evenings and mornings, before maybe the Beit HaMikdash will be cleansed again and everything will be set right again. What does that mean? 2300 days, that's like a little more than 6 years. What exactly does that mean? It's unclear. Like a number of the visions in Daniel, the meaning is uncertain. And even Daniel himself says that he does not understand it. And then as we zoom out, this concept of the Ketz, of a time period, a fixed time period for the end of days, shows up elsewhere in Tanakh as well. So for example, in the book of Habakkuk, that also talks about in the second chapter about a Ketz, a fixed time period after which there will be a great final judgment. Also, the book of Yeshayahu talks in much more detail about Acharit Hayamim, the end of days. So, okay, that's kind of the extent of it in Tanakh. But then kind of moving forward in history, in the late Second Temple times, my dad could tell more about this, but the Qumran community, famous for the Dead Sea Scrolls, was intensely invested in thinking about the end times, and they too had forecasts about that period and where they fit into it. In our tradition, so that's kind of not exactly our tradition, but in our tradition, kind of the part of Judaism that we're part of, things went in a different direction. So in the period of the Tanaim and Amoraim, basically in the period of the Talmud, we find a strong distaste for these kinds of attempts to calculate the timing of the end of days. And the most extended discussion on this topic is found in Masechet Sanhedrin, in the famous Perek Chelek, the 11th chapter. And Perek Chelek deals with many mysterious topics, the end of days, the afterlife, and more. And the discussion in the Gemara begins with the following statement. It says, Tana Devei Eliyahu, Sheshet Alafim Shana Have Alma. The world will last for 6,000 years. Shnei Alafim Tohu, the first 2,000 years are the period of Tohu, of chaos, let's say. Shnei Alafim Torah, the next 2,000 years will be the period of Torah. And Shnei Alafim Yemot HaMashiach, and the last 2,000 years, the last third, will be the period of Mashiach. Okay, now wait, this says that the period of Mashiach should have started in the year 4000 of our count. We're in the year 5785. So what exactly is the story? And the Gemara goes on to explain that due to our sins, the Mashiach has not yet come, even though we theoretically are in the period of Mashiach. We're into that period, but we have not yet merited for the coming of Mashiach. And then the Gemara continues. That's kind of how the Gemara gets into the discussion, but it's an extended discussion. The Gemara continues with a wide-ranging discussion on our topic, on the topic of calculating when the Mashiach will come and how much we know about that. So the Gemara talks about certain rabbis who made various predictions about when Mashiach would come, and the Gemara notes, that those all turned out to be wrong. The Gemara tells us about Rabbi Zera, who, when he came across different rabbis trying to calculate when Mashiach would come, he would say to them, please stop. He would say, what you're doing only delays the coming of Mashiach. The more you focus on it, the less likely you are to find it. And the Gemara then goes on and goes further. It says, quote, may those who calculate the end be cursed, Because when the end that is calculated comes, meaning when you set your date, but Mashiach does not come, they'll say he is never coming. Okay, so if you say that you know the date and then it turns out to be wrong, and that date passes, the Gemara says that's gonna cause people to lose faith. So then the Gemara says, rather wait for him, as it says, even though it will delay, wait for him. Basically, that we should, im kol ze achak elo, basically. Okay, so then Rav explains. This is what Rav says. All the end of days that were calculated have passed. Okay. He says it's not about a fixed date, but rather the matter depends only upon repentance and good deeds. Okay. And then on the next daf, the Gemara tells an amazing story about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who the Gemara tells us meets the Mashiach. He meets the Mashiach. And he asks him, when are you coming? When will you arrive? And the Mashiach answers, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, he says, today. But then he doesn't come. So then Eliyahu Navi explains to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that what the Mashiach meant was to say, Hayom im bekolo yishmo. Today I will come if Bnei Israel listens to Hashem's voice. So that's kind of the same idea that was brought before, that maybe there it seems to be that to the extent that there is a ketz, it's hard to calculate and it depends on our actions. Okay, that's all. That's that whole discussion in Masechet Sanhedrin. Elsewhere in Masechet Megillah, we're told that a bat kol, a heavenly voice, rang out, forbidding the great Tana Rabbi Yochanan ben Uziel from composing a targum like an explanatory translation. Okay, this bat kol calls out and says, "Do not write a targum for the books of Ketuvim." Why? Lest he reveal the ketz, lest he reveal the secret date of the coming of Mashiach. Rashi explains that discussion of the Gemara is worried exactly about translating the chapter in Sefer Daniel, that 8th chapter that we discussed before. So basically, the Bat Kol says, don't translate that. That is not to be explained, let's say. Okay, so that's how all that is just a little overview of how the Gemara deals with this issue of calculating the ketz. Basically, the Gemara is not a fan, okay? But with time, and the galut drags out longer and longer, seemingly without end. With time, we start to see a split between, on the one hand, some of our rabbis who continued on with the Gemara's, let's just say, skeptical view about the project of calculating when Mashiach will come, or the outside date by which he should come, okay? Versus other rabbis who perhaps thought differently or couldn't help themselves, or however you want to think about it. They did get into the business of predicting the date of the coming of days. So on the side, let's look at those two camps. On the side of the people who continue to downplay this whole enterprise of calculating the end of days, perhaps, maybe not surprisingly, the most prominent is the Rambam. So in the last chapter of Hilchot Melachim, the laws of kings, Rambam talks about the Mashiach. And Rambam says that we only know things about the Mashiach in broad strokes. But Rambam's careful to say that none of the details of how all of this is going to play out is really known to us. He says we have no authoritative traditions on this matter. Rather, all the forecasts about the end of times are really a matter of, you could say, interpretation by the rabbis, or speculation, reasoning. This is how the Rambam says. He says, Gam hachachamim ein lahem kabbalah bidvarim elu. The chachamim, the sages, have no established tradition regarding these matters. Ella lafi hachra'ah hapsukim. They are interpreting basically the psukim. V'lefichach, therefore, yesh lahem machloket bidvarim elu. And that's why they disagree, because they're all just trying to reason through it, basically. Val kol panim ein sidur havot dvarim elu velo dikdukehem ikar badat. And in any case, debate regarding all these questions in all of its detail are not among the fundamental principles of the faith. Basically, in big picture, it's one of the ani ma'amins, but in the details, none of that is dogma, let's say. And the Rambam continues, And he says as follows. He says, I'm just going to say the rest in the interest of time in English. He says, a person should not occupy himself with the agadot and with various midrashim concerning these matters, nor should he consider them as essentials, for study of them will neither bring fear or love of God. Similarly, one should not try to determine the appointed time for the Mashiach's coming. And then he quotes this line. He says, may the spirits of those who attempt to determine the time of the Mashiach's coming expire. So basically he quotes, kind of this strong stuff, which we saw before of basically don't do this. And in the same camp, we find, for example, Ibn Ezra, his commentary on that line about 2,300 evenings and mornings from Daniel. Ibn Ezra says, do not try to use this mysterious line to figure out the timing of the Ketz in real life. Don't put this into practice. Ibn Ezra points out that even Daniel himself said that he didn't understand what all of these visions meant. So just leave the matter alone, says Ibn Ezra, says the Rambam. And that seemed pretty clearly to be the conclusion of the Gemara as well. Nevertheless, there's a long history of attempts to calculate the Ketz, attempting to calculate, again, when Mashiach will come, when the end of day period will come. If you look at various commentaries on that line from Daniel, you see a number of attempts to use that line to calculate the Ketz. So, for example, Sadia Gaon lived in the late 800s into the early 900s. He dies in 942. He interpreted the verse from Daniel, that pasuk, to teach us that the Mashiach would come in the year 988. So he lives from 882 to 942. His prediction was the Mashiach would come by the year 988. Rashi lived between 1040 and 1105. He also calculated, based on interpretation of Psukim, the Mashiach would come by the year 1397. And Abarbanel lived, he lived from 1437 to 1508. Okay, he lives through the Spanish expulsion in the year 1497. So just a few years after that kind of trauma of the expulsion from Spain, Abarbanel predicted the Mashiach would come in the year 1503, just 6 years ahead of his prediction. Anyways, this temptation to predict the date of the coming of Mashiach persisted even into the modern period. So the Malbim, for example, the Malbim lives in Eastern Europe. He lived between 1809 and 1879. He predicted that the Mashiach would come in the year 1914. In the end, 1914 actually was a very consequential year. I mean, World War I began that year, but it wasn't quite messianic, though it must have felt like the world was coming to an end. And in fact, Rav Kook talks about the impact of what would have then been called the Great War, right? World War I, as we call it now. He talks about how the war had a great impact on him and how he thought that it must be the Chevelei Mashiach, the birth pangs of the coming of Mashiach, perhaps the war to end all wars. And Rav Kook spoke in messianic language often about what was happening in his times. He used this phrase, Atchalta de Geula, the beginnings of redemption. Atchalta de Geula. Okay, so the beginnings of redemption. Rav Kook saw the world through messianic eyes, like Sadia Gaon, like Rashi, like Abarbanel, and others. He saw the world just changing quickly and had a sense that the coming of Mashiach had to be, at least in the not too distant future, though he was very careful not to make any predictions. And we'll talk a little bit more about Rav Kook in a minute. And obviously in contemporary times, Chabad has, embraced in very imminent language when talking about Mashiach, not with a particular date, but just kind of with the line, you don't have to say more than the line, we want Mashiach now, we don't want to wait, right? That kind of gives a sense of immediacy, let's say, okay, without a date, without any attempt to pin down exactly when, but soon, very soon. Okay. Anyways, point of all that is there's a pretty wide range in our tradition regarding this question of how actively we should delve into the project of predicting. And you could say it's like a spectrum of views. On one end of the spectrum, you could have what we call, what you might call the patient waiters. Okay. And that, as we saw, was the predominant view of the Gemara. That's the view of the Rambam and the Ibn Ezra. basically don't get too involved in predicting things that you can't know. The predictions always turn out wrong, and there's a real downside if you guess at a date and you miss. And you can actually see that in the formulation of Rambam's 12th principle, the 12th Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin b'emunah shlema b'viyat Mashiach. I believe with a complete faith in the coming of Mashiach. But that's kind of the first line. But then the second line is Ve'af al pi she'yitmamea im kol zeh achake lo b'chol yom she'yavo. And even though he may delay, nevertheless, I will wait every day that he will come. Basically, I believe, but I will wait. I will wait patiently for as long as it takes. Okay, so that's kind of one end of the spectrum, the patient waiters, let's just say. At the other end of the spectrum, at the very far end of the spectrum, farther than anyone that we've talked about so far, you might talk about people who are very practical about Mashiach, who don't just want to wait. There are people who want Mashiach now and actually believe that they're living in the times of Mashiach. That's also part of our history, right? Truly messianic Jews who came to believe that the Ketz had come in their day. And this is the long history of either false messiahs or failed messiahs of Jewish history. Okay, and there have been a bunch of examples. Notably, you could include Jesus in that list of people who had whether claimed themselves to be Mashiach or at least their followers claimed that they were Mashiach. There was Bar Kokhba, the leader of the Jewish rebellion against Rome, who the Gemara tells us Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, declared that he was the Mashiach until the rebellion failed. Later on in Jewish history, the most famous false Messiah probably is Shabtai Tzvi, and we won't go through all the details of his story, but maybe for another time. It's a fascinating story, and of course, the 17th century Kabbalist had many, many followers. Really, he was a phenomenon. And so many followers believed that he was the Mashiach until eventually he was ordered by the Ottoman Sultan to convert to Islam, which he did. And even then, many of his followers continued to believe in him. And that story goes on actually for a long time after even his death. So that's at the very far other extreme, right? People who believe the Mashiach is truly there in their day, okay? Somewhere in between the patient waiters and kind of the Mashiach in their day, kind of practical Mashiachs, let's say, there's a lot of space in between. There's a lot of room for you to fit somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. And in between you have, just for example, people who kind of thought about this. We have all the predictors, the ones that we talked about, Sajago and Rashi, Abarbanel, Malbim, etc. They lived through very difficult times in Jewish history and all came to believe the Mashiach was almost there, right? Almost there in their day, but not just almost there, not just hopeful, but predictable. So that's kind of one view. And then we also talked a little bit about Rav Kook. He had a different view, right? So he felt that he was living at the beginning of Messianic times, at the Atchalta de Geula, that the end times were off on the horizon, kind of visible, but not quite there. But Rav Kook was very careful not to pick a date. He recognized that it could be long and slow, that process, and he understood that it might not be a direct path, that there could be ups and downs to come. Anyways, he felt strongly that we were heading in the right direction, but what exactly the path and the timing of all that was, he was careful not to get into. Okay, so that's a long background. On, I think, an interesting topic. Now, with all of that, let's get to this address, the Sikha that Rav Amital gave in May of 2005. So that is about 20 years ago. And interesting, on Yom Ha'atzmaut, May of 2005. And the historical backdrop for that Sikha that he gave is important to understand, because he's very clearly and overtly talking about the politics of his day. So the hot political topic in Israel at the time was Ariel Sharon's disengagement plan from Gaza. And just to remind everyone of that timeline, so Sharon became prime minister in 2001. In 2003, he gave a speech about how if we couldn't find a peace, a negotiated peace, then Israel would take unilateral steps, including potentially pulling out of Gaza. And this led to years of political wrangling where Sharon was trying to push it through, and he wasn't able to do it with his initial coalition that included the Likud, and then he put together a new coalition that included Labor. Anyways, by the time you get to February of 2005, so that's the year, kind of the key year here, the Knesset approved the disengagement plan by a vote of 59 in favor, 40 opposed, and 5 abstaining. And the plan was scheduled to be put into implementation in August of 2005. So February is when the Knesset finally kind of passes it, and they say that by August this is going to happen. So Yom Ha'atzmaut, May, is in between that period, and that is when this speech was being given. Rav Amital got up and he gave the speech about 4 months ahead of the expected evacuation of the Israeli, the IDF from Gaza, but also of the evacuation of all the 21, kind of communities in the Gaza Strip, including most notably Gush Katif, right? So that is how this speech begins. It starts, and I'm going to quote. So I'll quote. It says, he says, although intellectually I understand the importance of our celebration today, that is Yom Ha'atzmaut, it's psychologically and emotionally difficult for me to rejoice. One reason for this difficulty concerns the upcoming events in Gush Katif. So up front, he's like, I get it. It's Yom Ha'atzmaut, and we're in the middle of a very intense political situation. And then he says, quote, along with my anxiety for the residents of Gush Katif, I also have grave concerns, which should not be hidden, regarding the security situation following the disengagement, and regarding the political results of the disengagement process as well. My personal opinion, says Rav Amital, is that until the coming of the Mashiach, we will have problems with the Arab world. The question is just at what level. Okay. Yet, despite his anxiety about the current situation, Rav Amital says that Yom Ha'atzmaut is, it's still Yom Ha'atzmaut, and so we have to celebrate for all that we have, even if it's not perfect, which leads kind of to where he's heading, which is that Rav Amital laments that he says for the first time in his life, he's hearing about religious people in Israel, people in the Dati Leumi camp, in the national religious camp, quote, calling on us not to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut and not to recite Hallel this year. Says that there were some people who had so lost their faith in the state of Israel as a positive thing for the Jewish people. He says this is a minority view, but that there are enough of these people that he felt the need to address it. And then he says something interesting. This is another quote. He says, it seems to me that the main problem stems from the fact that among various groups, doubts have begun to arise concerning the expression Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. Very interesting. He says, and he says, I'm going to lay out for you what these folks believe. He says that for a certain group of people, if all the state does is allow the Jewish people to live in the land of Israel under their own sovereignty for the first time in 2,000 years, but even so, that would not be enough. That's good. It's not a bad thing. But if we're truly living in the beginning of the redemption, in the Achalta de Geula, in some, kind of early messianic period, then we should expect more. We should set our expectations higher, not just for Jews living safely and prospering in the land of Israel as a majority, as kind of under our own government. If we're in the beginning of the Geula, then we should expect more. We should expect full Geula, something much bigger than what we have today. We should expect kind of the coming of a true redemption. And here's a quote. It says, according to this understanding, if a major aspect of the state is the fulfillment of the command to exercise sovereignty over Eretz Yisrael, then a state that hands over territory betrays its purpose, and we must question whether it is still, quote, Reshit Smichat Geulatenu. Okay, so this is Rav Amital trying to give the thinking of this group of people that he is going to argue against. But he's trying to kind of lay out how they would view it. Basically, that the fact that that the state would give up sovereignty or control, let's say, over certain parts of Eretz Yisrael is so damning of the whole project of Medinat Yisrael that the project ought to be either abandoned or somehow, whatever, kind of really dealt with, because people were this again, for this group of people, they were losing faith. Okay. So then Rav Amital says, well, wait a second, I just gave you their opinion. Let me tell you how I think about this term, Reshit Smichat Yolatenu. He says that the way he understands it, which he says is the way that he will argue it was generally understood, is that when we say that Medinat Yisrael is Reshit Smichat Yolatenu, what we're saying is basically, thank you, Hashem, for giving us a taste of redemption, a first flowering foretaste of what redemption feels like. Okay, it's not ultimate redemption, but it is a taste right now. Kind of like in the way that Shabbat we say is me'ein olam haba. It's not like we're about to enter olam haba, but it gives you a taste of the flavor of olam haba. It's a taste of what's to come. And that alone is something to be thankful for. And he says, very interestingly, so here's another line. He says, quote, I can testify concerning myself that I recited the blessing of Shechayanu, and I danced on the 29th of November, 1947 at Beirut Yitzchak, even though the UN had partitioned the land, and likewise in 1948. He says, our feeling was one of elation. It was as though there was an intoxicating drug in the air, Israeli independence. Okay, so basically what he's saying is we use that term, Reshit Smichat Yolatenu, when we had far less. So let's just keep in mind that like even that was a taste of redemption. And he kind of pushes forward. He says, think about the times of Hanukkah, the times of the Chashmonaim. He says, was that a full redemption? No, but they did experience a great redemption. And so basically what he's trying to say is that Geulah is not all or nothing. It's not like Mashiach or bust. Okay, and this is kind of, I'll give you more lines that kind of give the feeling of what he's getting at. So here's another line. He says, in 1948, we did not speak of Mashiach. We prayed for Malchut Yisrael and sufficed with sovereignty comparable to the Second Temple period. And then he says, there's no doubt that we've attained at least that much. Okay, so what he's pointing out is, he's saying that the whole Second Temple period was not a full Geulah, and yet, isn't that something that we look back on as having been, a time that we look back on positively? So too, even if we have less than Mashiach, like a full redemption, is that not still something that you should be overjoyed with, let's say? And he says further, he says, quote, when Rav Herzog spoke of the first flowering of our redemption, he did not mean the messianic redemption. Rather, he meant the simple redemption consisting of Jewish sovereignty in the land. Okay, so that is Rav Amital's first point. He basically says, to those whose disillusionment with the state was mounting in that period, in that very intense period, to those who were kind of giving up hope on the project entirely, he was saying, let's not lose sight of the big picture. That the very existence of the state of Israel, whether it be perfect or not, whether it be less than full Geulah, it's still a wonder. In its current state, it is already a taste of redemption, even as it fights for its life. Even in 1948, when we controlled only a fraction of what we wound up getting, and even if the state was weaker and in even more danger at the time, we were using that term, Reshit Smichat Yolatenu, not, he says, not as saying that we were predicting that Mashiach was just around the corner, but rather as a way of saying thank you that we are experiencing this foretaste of what it would be to be redeemed. That itself is a meaningful redemption. Okay, and that leads to kind of Rav Amital's second point, which is that we need to be very careful not to assume that Mashiach's around the corner. Hope is different, but not to assume. As we saw with that whole history lesson that we started with about the dangers of kind of guessing or calculating the date. Predictions about the coming of Mashiach have never turned out well for us. This is how Rav Amital puts it. He says, I think this is kind of poignant. He says, quote, in the previous generation, there were rabbis who spoke about the beginning of the redemption, right? Basically, Atchalta de Geula, or quote, the revealed end, or the footsteps of the Mashiach. Ikve Mashiach, right? So all these different terms that were used, he says, a generation earlier to discuss what they felt like they were living in the early 1900s, a feeling that they were living at the beginning of messianic times. Okay, and he says, quote, and a few years later came the greatest Holocaust that ever happened in all of Jewish history. Anyone who thought that he was witnessing the signs of the complete redemption was proved wrong in the Holocaust. Actually, I think, very powerful thought. Okay, in other words, we had people who are optimistic in the early part of the 20th century that they were living in the footsteps of the Mashiach. It was not a straight line. It was anything but a straight line. Basically, don't be lured into this age-old trap of thinking that you know when the end of days is coming. Now, why does all this matter? Okay, this sounds super theoretical. Why is he pushing so hard on this topic of don't guess at the date? Don't guess that it's tomorrow. Hope that it's tomorrow, but don't assume that it's tomorrow. Okay? Why? Because Rav Amital says, and again, he's just being super kind of he's not holding back, talking about his own times. He explains that in his opinion, following the Six-Day War, a shift happened in the thinking of many people within the Dati Leumi camp. He says that their understanding, the understanding of many of what it meant to live in Reshit Smichat Gulatenu, began to shift. From what he says, the term originally meant, which was, as we've discussed, a thanksgiving, a way of saying thank you. Thank you for a taste of redemption, more redemption than we've had in a long time. He says that as we were able to triumph to such a high level in the Six-Day War, some kind of mental shift happened where that term started to mean an expectation that the full redemption was around the corner. And he suggests that something shifted in that period. Again, the sense that what we were about to experience was Geulah Shlema, full redemption. And if you think that Geulah Shlema is around the corner, then why settle for a first flowering of redemption? Why settle for the first flowering if you can have the real thing? So, what Rav Amital was kind of getting at in this speech on Yom Ha'atzmaut 20 years ago, 2005, as the Gaza disengagement loomed and was hotly contested and debated internally. Basically, what he was saying was, don't think that you can calculate the Ketz. Don't think that you know what the path to Mashiach looks like. Basically, don't make decisions in your day based on your expectation that Mashiach is coming. Basically, don't let Mashiach interfere with the hard decisions that a state needs to make. We can disagree about what the right moves for the state might be, politically, militarily. Those are hard questions because Israel's in a hard neighborhood. And there are all of these hard questions that it's constantly facing. But basically, I think what Rav Amital is getting at is saying that we should just say and kind of admit to ourselves that these are difficult issues, that there's no silver bullet, that we can't avoid the complexity of the issues by hoping that something will bail us out so that things will just go well without our having to make hard decisions. Okay, now, I should say, and this kind of stands behind all of this, that in the scheme of Roshei Yeshivot, within the Hesder movement, Rav Amital was very much on the more dovish side, right? So he was open to political settlements, land for peace, at least to the extent that that would lead to peace. But I actually don't think that his position on the topic is really what matters here. I think the more interesting point that he's making, regardless of where someone might come out on, how these hard questions should be resolved, I think it's worth and again, whether you would agree or disagree with where he landed on that point, I think that the real kind of essence of the point is that whatever we decide to do about these complex issues, and people will come to different conclusions, you have to own your decisions. You have to own the consequences and the trade-offs of whatever it is that you're arguing for, because you can hope that none of this will matter and that Mashiach will make all of these hard questions kind of go away. And that would be fantastic, but you can't rely on that. And in the absence of that, we should just note that the history of calculating the end of days has not been a happy one for us. Okay. Now, also interestingly, so that was this kind of Sikha by Rav Amital. I just was reading it because it relates so much to what we're going through today, 20 years later, with kind of the way that the Gaza disengagement played out. And obviously we don't need to go through all of that, but it's just so interesting to read somebody's reflections at the beginning of the process. Anyways, interestingly, a very similar point to what we just went through also shows up in another piece that I was reading recently by another Rosh Yeshiva of another Hesder Yeshiva by Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, who was the former Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Birkat Moshe in Ma'ale Adumim, also one of Rabbi Sachs's teachers. And he wrote a piece called, quote, "The Religious Significance of the State of Israel." Okay, and he makes the point, maybe even more strongly. I'll read you the way that he puts it. It's a little bit extended, so I'm going to read through this. He says, this is Rabbi Rabinovich talking. He says, the process of Israel's return to Zion requires us to understand that we must conduct ourselves in a manner that is worthy of a people that has returned to its land to become masters of its own fate. We must show our gratitude to God for this and understand the gravity of our responsibility in light of these epochal changes. Yet, we must make sure not to interpret the sage's words superficially, and we certainly must not use slogans like obvious signs of the end of days. I actually don't know exactly how to translate that, but anyways, this was something he's arguing against. So there are people saying we're obviously at the end of days. He says no. Again, this is going back to him. He says, do not use these as a factor in our decision to do something or refrain from doing something. The view that we are presently undergoing a surefire, unstoppable process of redemption is an unparalleled delusion based on nothing. He's not mincing words. Okay? He says that view is an unparalleled delusion based on nothing. It can, God forbid, cause people to think that they can do all kinds of things without the need for prudence or discretion, because after all, this is obviously the end of days. And if you didn't get the message yet, Rabinovich goes on to say this maybe even more strongly, okay? There's another quote. He says, are we confident about how this process will play out? The pretentious usurpation of the prophet's role based on fanciful interpretations and simplistic and superficial understanding of midrashim or signs from heaven can, God forbid, result in terrible tragedy. If we do not know how to preserve what we've been given, is God nevertheless obligated towards us? There's a great danger in the pretension to know that the footsteps of Mashiach can be heard. It can lead to irresponsible conclusions and policy decisions with potentially disastrous consequences. Again, this is a Rosh Yeshiva of a Hesder Yeshiva, right? This is the second in a row. And this is not to say that this represents like the entire Hesder movement, but it's just to note, this isn't like, anyways, it's just very interesting. Again, he's making a very, very similar point. Beware the temptation to forecast the end of days. Beware the temptation to let your sense that you're already that close to messianic times that should affect your decisions in the here and now. And interestingly, Rav Rabinovich, again, in this totally separate piece, makes the same point that we heard kind of echoing what Rav Amital had said. Every year we celebrate Hanukkah. Every year we celebrate that as amazing and miraculous, even though it was not a Geulah Shlema. It was not full redemption. He says, quote, this teaches us that God's salvation of the Jewish people is not measured by the yardstick of the end of days. Basically, no one thinks about canceling the holiday of Hanukkah because it didn't lead to Geulah Shlema. A pretty decent point. Okay, so we've been through a lot. I'm just going to close. Different folks will take away different things from this, I'm sure. Okay, but I think it's safe to say that we're living in times when the state of Israel is dealing with ongoing complex challenges on many fronts. And they're real challenges that probably aren't going away overnight. And hard problems are not fun because they don't have perfect solutions, right? Hard problems, they're just difficult. They involve trade-offs and sacrifices and risk and uncertainty. And we've been through that over the last couple of years of should we be doing this and should we be doing that? And some people think obviously we should be doing this, and some people thinking obviously they should be doing that. Anyways, the bottom line is these are very hard decisions, I would say, on so many. We could rattle off a series of very hard decisions. But there's no alternative to hard decisions. And I think what we're getting from these different pieces that we went through tonight is kind of an echo of another statement from the Gemara, which is Ein somchin al hanes. We don't rely on miracles. Okay, we don't rely on miracles to save the day. Here's a related line from the Gemara on Shabbat. It says, Le'olam al yamod adam b'makom sakana lomar shosin lo nes. A person should not stand in a dangerous place and say that a miracle will come to save him. Shema, lest, ein osin lo nes. Perhaps the miracle will not come. Ve'im osin lo nes. And even if the miracle does come, menakin lo mizchuyotav. It will, this is a little hard to translate, but it will be deducted from his merits. Okay, so maybe this is very interesting. The Gemara basically says danger is sometimes real. Don't just kind of hope or believe it away. Okay, and the Gemara gives two reasons. First of all, because waiting for a miracle might not work. You might not get bailed out. So basically, here's some good advice. Don't try that. That's a bad move. But second, even if it works out for you against all odds, menakin lo bizchuyotav, it takes something away from you. Okay, living your life relying on miracles isn't for free. Maybe that's one way to say it. So, bottom line, we should operate with a sense of confidence that we can overcome our challenges, and that if we put in our efforts, we'll have support from above. Okay, that is something really worth believing. But that's not the same thing as kind of wishing away the fact that that some dangers are real. And I think what these kind of couple of pieces that we went through tonight both argue for is something like we've come too far to bet the farm on miracles. So basically, ani ma'amin, 100%, but also ein somchin al hanes. We should move forward with confidence, but also with our eyes wide open to the dangers that we face, so that until the Ketz actually arrives, which we're not particularly good at calculating, until then, there's no replacement for wise decision-making and good leadership. And in both cases, with kind of our eyes wide open to the realities of the world that we live in today. So hopefully that will guide us as we seem to be hopefully at the back end of a very difficult period. Okay, I'll leave off with that.